Are you brave enough to take this midnight drive? If you love terrifying true horror stories, subscribe to Nocturnal Nightmares TV for more spine-chilling tales. Hit like if this kept you up at night and turn on notifications, because next time, the story might be about you. The Shadow's Pursuit. The full moon loomed low in the sky, casting long, eldritch shadows on the tree-lined country road. Robert was a tired veteran driver heading home from work. Normally, the solitary starkness of a nighttime drive calmed him, but tonight something was wrong. As he drove, he spotted a strange shadow flickering just beyond his peripheral vision. It appeared to be keeping pace with him, darting between trees and keeping with his car. He thought at first it was a trick of the moonlight, but the shadow remained there, growing more unmistakable by the second. A human figure emerged from the shadow, and Robert's heart raced. It stood 6 feet and loomed like a tree, but with limbs longer than an orangutan. The shape darted back and forth through trees and across the road, faster than any human could move, and pressed down the accelerator to get away from that horrible sight. But no matter how quickly he drove, the shadow stayed with him, always just out of his line of sight. It was almost mocking him, challenging him to go faster, to push his mind against the impossible. Miles passed and the road twisted and curved deeper into the countryside. He had lost all track of time, and the shadow knew it. It appeared to become emboldened, its movements more frenetic, more threatening. Robert's brain was on overdrive, searching for logic where there was none. It was merely a hallucination, he told himself, a product of his exhaustion and the solitude of the drive. But as the silhouette darted around his vehicle, he started to feel the prickles of dread decorate his spine. The road made a sudden turn, and Robert was unable to steer the car. It careened across the asphalt, whirling in a wild, out-of-control spin. The dark shadow around the dying man shared a chuckle with its grinning visage. Robert's heart raced as the car came to a halt. He took a deep breath to get himself back under control as he looked out the window. The shadow was gone. He breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. As his eye flicked to the rearview mirror, he saw the shadow again, this time standing in the middle of his lane, arms extended to claw his way. Robert realized he needed to embrace the shadow, to wrestle his demons. He opened the car door, emerging into the cool night air. The shadow would not move, staring at him with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He stepped forward, then another, walking towards the silhouette with a renewed sense of purpose. Shadows filled the darkness, his eyes straining against the light, but his instincts took over as he got closer. The shadow began to lose its shape, losing itself to the dark. Yet its presence remained, a ghostly memory of the horror he had faced. Robert crawled back into his car, his body trembling from adrenaline and fear. He turned the engine over and drove away slowly from where the shadow had been. When he returned home, he couldn't help but think that the shadow had followed him home, keeping a watchful eye on him from the lips of the blackness. He knew he would never forget that night, the terror that had pursued him through the countryside, the shadow that moved faster than his car. But he also knew that he had conquered his fear, that he had battled the unknown and prevailed. It was a tiny victory, a little one, but one that was powerful and filled him with strength and a sense of determination. And as he drove up the driveway to his house, he vowed he would never again take for granted the solitude of the night. Robert never drove after dark again, to escape the chance of running into the shadow again. From then onwards, the memory of that night stayed with him, highlighting the darkness which was always right outside the edge of the light. And while he never noticed that shadow again, he knew it remained out there, lurking in the shadows, watching him with its unblinking eyes. He sensed it, a bitter, foreign alien in his world. But he denied it dominion over himself, over his fears, over his actions. He realized that he was strong enough to fight it, to battle the unknown and win. And thus, he drove, cruised through the rural breaks, silhouettes spooling beyond his sinuses. But he was not afraid anymore, not a victim of the terror that walked the night. He was a survivor, a warrior who had gone into the abyss and come out the other side even stronger. And though the shadow remained, he was confident that he could stand up to it, that he could never again be afraid of the dark. The road that wasn't on the map. Margaret and Daniel had been married for 15 years. Their lives had fallen into predictable rhythms, an endless loop of work, dinner, and quiet evenings at home. But on a particularly beautiful day in autumn, the couple decided that their routine weekend drive to the coast deserved a more adventurous detour. "Let's go back roads," Margaret said, tracing her finger along a paper map. "I heard there's this quaint little village right off Highway 12. Why not?" "It'll be fun," Daniel said, taking out his phone and ignoring the map altogether. Who needed paper anyway, after all, in this day and age? But the signal was so spotty that they kept losing the plot, in both the literal and figurative sense of the word, as they drifted farther from the well-trod path. They drove for nearly an hour before they came across a cracked, faded sign that read Locket Hollow with an arrow pointing left. After a moment's pause, Daniel yanked the wheel. The path was not broken, dominated by tall trees bending over one another like they were confiding secrets a bridge aside his time. It seemed remote. The sounds were the rustle of leaves and the call of unseen birds. "It's nice," Margaret said, folding away the map and putting it away with nostalgia. "Yeah, but where is this place?" Daniel said, narrowing his eyes in suspicion. The trees grew thicker, branches arcing overhead, blotting out the sun, suffocating. The air came cool and thick, the tang of damp mosses and something sweet dry, like time trapped in dust. The GPS eventually failed, leaving Daniel to search blindly for his device. "No signal," he grunted. "It shouldn't be too far." With no alternative left to them, they soldiered on, praying that they would soon happen upon the village. But as the scenery changed to an unsettling stillness, discomfort set in. Shadows moved in unnatural ways at the corners of their eyes, and the birds suddenly stopped chirping. A prickling sensation crept up the spine of Daniel. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice low. "What?" Margaret frowned, staring into the rising darkness. "Like we're being watched." He shuffled in his seat, eyed the rearview mirror, and felt an irrational need to make sure they weren't being followed. But the road behind them held nothing but twisting trees and that dimming light. Minutes became hours, or it felt that way, as they passed nothing of interest, only the same trees, all twisted limbs intertwined like gnarled lovers. Dread crashed into the pit of Daniel's stomach. Then they spotted it, a glimmer of light in the distance, the hope that perhaps there was life past this stifling stretch of road. It was what seemed a rickety inn, its sign creakingly swinging reading the Hollow Breach Lodge. The two shared looks filled with excitement and trepidation. Maybe this was Locket Hollow, after all. They pulled into the gravel patch before the inn, its windows dim and the door slightly ajar, bedecked with strange carvings. "Perhaps we could ask for directions," Margaret suggested, bravely stepping toward the entrance. Daniel hesitated, but when Margaret nudged the door open with a soft creak, he followed. Inside, cobwebs fell like curtains and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. Shadows danced along the walls, and an age-old wooden counter lay collecting dust. "Hello," Margaret called out, her voice ringing in the quiet. No response. Then there came a shuddering noise from the back room, a gentle shuffle. It sounded like footsteps. "We ought to get," Daniel began, but he got no further. A figure stepped from the gloom. It was an old man, skin sagging like a bottle left uncorked too long, dressed in ragged garb that spoke of a time long forgotten. "You don't belong here," he rasped, his eyes glazed and piercing at once as if they could see through me. "We were just looking for Locket Hollow," stammered Margaret, her heart pounding. The man laughed low and deep and haunting. "There's no map for this road, lovelies. It's a road leading to what you would rather forget." He raised a gnarled finger. "And you're not alone." Just at that moment, the outside world exploded with sound. A crushing weight descended around them, the sound of twigs breaking, of something waiting nearby. "Leave this place," the man hissed as he shoved them toward the front door. They emerged in shambles, breathing heavily, their heads spinning with air, fear and confusion. The inn vanished behind them, and the road shook and transformed in a dizzying arc. The trees shuttered around them, but as they fled, murmurs followed them, repeating their names like a nefarious chant. Reaching the car, breathless and in a panic, Daniel turned the key into the ignition, desperate to get away, hoping the accursed road would not hold them, prisoner, to this realm of evil. The ignition screeched to life, and they took off, looking back in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the blackened and trailing them with the mysterious figure in tow. But only the enveloping night was there. They drove on, misplaced once more among roads that appeared nowhere on any map. And within the still coals of their fear, they started to wonder if the road that they walked was not a road meant to be walked. The lights that don't belong to any car. As fragments of dusk dripped into the horizon, Stephen Thompson drove his old sedan along a winding road that slithered through the dense woods of Pine Hollow. It hummed gently, and the padded seats shaped themselves to him as though they were attempting to speak his woes, buried deep, out, and away. But he was a successful lawyer by day, and he sometimes sought solitude away from the demands of his life. But tonight was different. The impulse that had rushed at him through the hallway had been followed by a cold finger that wrapped around his spine. The road was empty, except for shadowy trees that leaned heavily with the weight of cedar and secrets. Stephen's thoughts strayed to his divorce, to the trial with its low appalling stakes and its horrible echoes of whispered accusations. Wanting to take a short break from his life, he cranked up the volume on his favorite classic rock station and let the music envelop him. Then he saw them, two pinprick headlights sparkling in his rearview mirror. They flickered like distant stars, coming closer with a speed that seemed impossible for a moment. Panic gripped his chest. For miles on this rural stretch, not a single car had passed him. It had to be moving faster than the vehicle could travel, right? He looked down at the speedometer. He was cruising at a relaxed 50 miles an hour. With his heart racing, Stephen floored the gas. On the other side, his headlights now spotlighted not only the pavement but the night, an intrusion of his creatures creating the sense of a living thing that was in there stalking him. The towering trees flanking the road knew his discomfort in his eyes as their bark-whirled trunks fell to watch him with dark eyes and black avarice. Stephen, intent on staying away from the mysterious car, pulled right onto the gravel shoulder and began to slow down so he could let that thing pass. He sensed sweat pricking the back of his neck as he stole a glance at the mirror. He expected to see a glimpse of an aggressive driver but was instead greeted with only an ever-widening void behind him. The headlights had vanished. He felt a troubling calm surround him, but just as he worked up the nerve to accelerate again, those headlights came back, this time burning straight up his ass, bright enough to shoot through the skin of night. He leaped, skin tightening atop the wheel, the deafening rock of his heart tattooing trying to break free of its cage. Just a trick of the light, he muttered under his breath, reassuring himself as he took a deep breath. Just a trick. The headlights did not falter, however. They were getting nearer, lighting the trees at each side, making phantom shadows that danced temptingly on the way. Heart pounding, Stephen shoved the gearshift back in drive and rocketed down the road, kicking rocks up behind him. The lights lunged forward, a fast predator closing in on its quarry. He looked back in his rearview mirror, and, to his chagrin, they were not merely following, they were changing, shape-shifting, bending, distorting, becoming dark, evil, terrible, horrific beings with each time they breathed. "No, no," he wailed, clutching the steering wheel so hard that the knuckles on his hands turned white. The road below him became a blur as he pushed harder on the accelerator. The screech of tires skimming over gravel echoed in the deepening dark. He was stuck in a nightmare of his own making. But as frantic and wild as his escape was, there was a part of him that wanted to just stop, turn and face whatever was coming for him. Maybe it wouldn't hurt. Perhaps it would explain the thrumming weight of fear that clung to his soul like ivy on an overgrown wall. Suddenly the eyes swept past him, blinking like mad and disappearing completely into a black hole. Stephen's breath hitching, he stalled, pulling over yet again, every rational muscle in his body shouting to drive the fuck away. But curiosity nibbled along the edge of his mind. His production of evidence that would declare it a figment of his imagination fell short, muffled by the pulse of fear. As he sat there, amid the thick silence, he was overcome by a feeling of remoteness, like the headlights Mark was driving with had not just disappeared but had taken something essential with them. The woods around him were as lonely as Afghan hills, hugging him closer than a leather-wrapped steering wheel. Sure that he could do it now, he got out of the car, each step crunching against the gravel like breaking glass. The atmosphere was heavy, not with the burnt tang of machine oil, but the sense of a long-held secret better left unexamined. He glanced down the road, desperately, waiting, maybe hoping, to see the shadows of headlights carrying on. Instead, there was nothing. A sudden rustle in the trees made his heart leap to his throat. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe something more sinister. Winds howled around him like fingers, coaxing him deeper into the forest. Maybe those headlights weren't a car at all. Maybe they were the lost souls of Pine Hollow, calling him to join their shadowy requiem. He took a step back, nervously glancing at the tree line. The headlights had come again, pale reflections that had skated through the corners of his peripheral vision, sneaking out of the depths of the woods where the trees kept secrets held to the void. At that instant, Stephen realized, they were not of this car, they were of the haunted crevices of his mind. The headlights danced over the past, like bright spotlights over tangled forest roots. And there he remained at the stroke of midnight, straddling two worlds, guided only by the erratic sweep of headlights into an uncertain fate. The silent town without people. So the needle was dangerously past E. Dale sighed, his stomach growling in protest. Another hour, maybe two, he'd be marooned on this godforsaken stretch of highway. Then he saw it in the distance, a group of buildings nestled together like frightened sheep. A town. He stepped on the gas, relief pouring over him. As he approached, a sign creaked in the wind, "Welcome to Havenwood." It wasn't much to look at. A main street with one-story shops, a gas station, a diner, and a church steeple peeking out in the distance. But it felt like civilization, and civilization, at the moment, meant gasoline. When Dale pulled into the shabby gas station, something strange caught his eye. The lights were on. Bright, fluorescent lights buzzed in the convenience store, highlighting rows of shelves filled with snacks and drinks. The gas pumps flashed a happy red. But there was no one there. He killed the engine, the abrupt silence amplifying the discomfort that was crawling into his gut. His voice, cracking in the stillness, calling out, "Hello? Anybody here?" Only the wind responded, whistling through the cracks in the boarded-up windows of a building across the street. He hesitantly got out of the car. The air was thick and stagnant and smelled of dust and something he couldn't put a finger on, something metallic and wrong. Heading for the convenience store, he opened the door. The little bell over it tinkled merrily. Once inside, it was like walking into a time machine. Magazines sit open on the counter, a crossword puzzle half solved. A pot of coffee brewed on a burner, the smell pungent and acrid. The TV in the corner crackled, filled with static. All was in its designated spot, preserved, untouched. But completely, horrifyingly empty. "Hello," he called again, his voice shaky and whispered this time. He stepped back into the store, eyes roving the aisles. Canned foods stood stacked on the shelves, frozen pizzas lay frosted in the freezer, and candy bars called from rainbow-colored displays. A child's drawing of a smiling sun was taped near the cash register. It felt less like an abandoned town and more like that everybody had just vanished. He walked to the back, compelled by a flickering light coming from a back room. As he approached the doorway, a deep, guttural growl reached his ears. His heart jumped into his throat. He froze, every muscle tense. He peeked around the doorframe, slowly, tentatively. The back room was a mess. Cardboard boxes littered the floor, and a single bare bulb dangled precariously from the ceiling, casting long, warped shadows. In the corner, curled up into a pile, was a dog. A big, black Labrador, bones protruding through its matted hair. Then it gazed up at him, its eyes blank and dead, repeating that low growl. Dale felt a pang of sympathy. "Hey boy," he spoke softly, taking a small tentative step closer. "You all right?" The dog remained unresponsive, staring intently at him, the low growl resonating deep in its chest. As Dale approached more closely, he saw something on the floor next to the dog. A pile of bones. Small bones. Small enough not to belong to a cow or a deer. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He took a step back slowly, his mind a blur. He had to get out of here. Now. He staggered back to the gas pump, fumbling with his wallet. He filled the tank and slapped the gas cap back on with shaky hands. He didn't want to pay, didn't want to leave any record of his existence in this godforsaken place. He just wanted to be gone. As he drove away from the gas station, however, he saw something more. The diner across the street. The neon sign flashed cheerily, advertising home cooking. Through the window, he could see place settings on the tables, catching the warm light. All appeared 100% normal. Except that no one was there. He continued past several other buildings. The church with the perfectly manicured lawn. The library, book-lined its shelves. The hardware store and its implements are neatly set. All ablaze, all pristine, all empty. He sped as fast as he dared, the speedometer needle creeping to the red. He didn't look back. He never wanted to lay eyes on Havenwood again. Now he had no idea what to make of what had happened, what had left behind the petrified corpses alluding to lives lived, but he thought maybe it started here. Hours later, as streaks of dawn smeared the sky, he finally arrived at another town. In a typical town, people walk on the streets, cars come through the intersections, sounds of daily life are reassuring. He stopped at a diner, ordered a coffee, and waited out the dread that clung to him like smoke. He didn't tell anyone about Havenwood. Who would believe him? A town without any people, but with all the lights. It felt like a nightmare, a product of his weary imagination. But every so often, when he was out driving late at night, he'd look at the gas gauge, and a shiver would go down his spine, and he'd feel that cold, creeping fear that somehow he'd end up back on that empty stretch of highway, with the silent, watching lights of Havenwood in the distance. Deep inside, he knew the town was waiting. This song is about waiting for someone to return. Waiting to have something come back, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever it wasn't going to be good. The ghost truck that will never let you leave. His rearview mirror shimmied, the reflected scene becoming slightly out of focus as Mark pressed down harder on the gas pedal. 78 miles per hour. Too fast for this section of Highway 17, but the red grille behind him was getting bigger. Not an actual grille, just the threatening, rectangular shape of a semi, glimmering in his mirrors. It had been visible a mile back, a distant pair of headlights in the inkiness of rural Florida. At first Mark didn't think twice about it. This road was lined with trucks transporting lumber and citrus down to the coast. But back then it was beginning to gain. He looked at the mirror again. Closing. Still closing. Cold, clammy panic started creeping up his spine. He floored it. The speedometer needle inched toward 90. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, muttering, "Come on, come on." The engine roared, the wind howled past the windows, and the outside world blurred into a smear of shadowy trees and the occasional lonely billboard. But the gurney was still there. An unyielding, red figure in his rearview mirror. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the driver was drunk. Maybe he was just a maniac. But the truck's behavior didn't make sense. It maintained its position perfectly, no swerving, no flickering its lights, just there. He recalled the old stories, the whispers he'd overheard at truck stops over cups of lukewarm coffee and stale donuts. Tales of haunted highways, ghost cars, and drivers who seemingly vanished without a trace. He'd always considered them tall tales, fodder for long nights on the road. Now, those stories scratched at the corners of his mind. He grimaced and grabbed for his phone, trembling. No signal. Of course. Out here, reality felt thinner, and you were easier prey for the things that lived in the periphery. He could make himself calm, and he worked to focus on the road ahead. He had to get to Ocala. He needed to return to civilization. The truck would not allow him to do so. He made a hard right onto a narrower county road, hoping to lose it in the twists and turns. The truck did, coiling the curves with ease, steering straight towards the dark, floodlights defiant on its prow, a stink of a red grille as thick as the weight of an overbearing democracy. He hit the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. He slammed the gear shifter to park and looked at the rearview mirror as his heart hammered in his chest. The truck halted, too, just a few feet behind him. Its engine hummed, a low, guttural growl that vibrated up through his bones. He couldn't see the driver. The cab was dark, a void. He cautiously crept toward the door handle. He had to find out who was driving this thing. He had to understand. When he touched the cool metal, the truck's lights flared, then flared brighter, blinding him. To complete his disinterested tableau, a low, mournful horn would drift through the curtain of night, a sound like something that not only rattled his ears but the very bones of his soul. He jerked back, adrenaline coursing through his body. He slammed the car into drive and took off, the horn still echoing in his ears. He drove for hours, it felt like, navigating twisting backroads, desperate to get away. The truck followed him, a silent, dogged pursuer. Whatever way he turned, whatever speed he drove at, it was always there, its colorless grille a spine-chilling harbinger of his fate. Broken and beaten, he pulled over yet again. This time, he didn't even get out. He sat there, staring into the rearview mirror and waiting. The truck pulled in behind him, its headlights stretching sound distortion. The steady throbbing of the engine, idling, matched that of his frantic heart. All of a sudden, the truck's driver's side door swung open. A silhouette appeared, framed against the light inside. It was tall and gaunt, its features hidden in the dark. The figure shuffled carefully, tentatively across toward his car. Mark was frozen in fear, not able to scream, unable to move. The figure approached his car, one hand hovering over the doorknob. He shut his eyes, preparing for the worst. Then came a voice, cracked and creaky, through the open window. "You're going the wrong way," it said. He opened his eyes. The figure was gone. The truck was gone. He was all by himself, in the middle of nowhere, and the only sound was the chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves. He gazed around, confused. He checked his phone. Still no signal. His hands shook as he started the car. He had no idea where he was. He didn't know where he was headed. He checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. Only the empty road stretched behind him. He put the car in reverse. And that's when he saw it. The red grille, bigger, closer, filling the entire mirror. The horn sounded, a gloomy, deafening blast. He never left Florida. A week later, they found his car, wrecked against a tree, miles from nowhere. No sign of him. No sign of any other vehicle. Just the wreckage and the smell of burnt rubber. Legend has it that he remains out there, driving the endless highways, forever caught in a game of cat and mouse with the big rig that never lets you go home. And sometimes, on a dark and lonely night, if you look in your rearview mirror, you may just see a pair of headlights, growing larger, closer. The sign that'll never make up its mind. Edgar drove the winding road at a low-setting sun filled the horizon, casting long shadows on the barren land in all directions. The air was too still, except for the leaves which rustled with a weak wind. He had been driving for almost an hour, his tires crunching over gravel with each turn, but the path was still eerily empty. It put him in mind of some old ghost story, the sort that lasts after the campfire has cooled and only embers glow like dimming memories. He had come this way in search of ancestral homelands, searching for a way to reconcile with the past that haunted him. A place where every stone had a story. Well, that's what he told himself before the itch to roam had distracted him. Rounding weather-beaten road signs, Edgar squinted at the one in front. "Welcome to Larkwood. 5 miles." It was the third time today he'd seen this sign, and it occurred to him that with that realization came a twinge of unease and a knot in his stomach. He had never heard of Larkwood, and his GPS said the town didn't exist. As he drove on, the nature of the view started to change, somewhat darker, somewhat more ominous. Tall trees hung thick, heavy with shadows, bending over us like skeletal fingers. A chill crept up his spine. Finally, the familiar sign wheezed into sight, but this time the arrows on it pointed in opposite directions. "Welcome to Larkwood, 5 miles." The words on the sign seemed to bark at him, in a strangely unsettling monotone, "This way." He shook his head, facing back toward the dashboard. Then, all at once, the engine sputtered, like an animal dying. A light on the panel began to blink. Suddenly, his headlights caught, lowering for an instant before roaring to life. Edgar's heart raced. A look at the sign disabused him of any notion things had improved. The arrows still pointed him forward, but the further he drove, the more disturbing the scenery became, a hopeless conflation of reality and the waking nightmare. Another mile went by, and just when he thought he'd leave this madness behind him, the sign came up again, except he was right in front of it now. As he came to a stop, he noticed an inscription at the bottom that had escaped his notice on those hurried journeys. "Welcome to Larkwood, 5 miles. Keep moving. Keep moving," he repeated to himself, a harsh laugh breaking from his lips. Was some elaborate prank being played? Or perhaps a strange omen? Edgar frantically fidgeted with his phone, struggling to bring up a signal, but no amount of jostling generated more than the network error on his screen. After a few moments of frustration, he returned his gaze to the path. Below the sign, he spied a narrow, steep path leading into the trees. His only other option was to investigate. He stepped cautiously into the thick underbrush. The atmosphere had changed. The decaying leaves crunched loudly under his footfalls, and the silence seemed heavy, an uncomfortable veil being wrapped around him. With every step forward, we learned more about this contorted path. There, in the distance, flickered a soft glow, and like a moth to flame he was drawn towards it. Edgar trailed, torn between curiosity and dread. And following that light led them to a clearing where there were embers of an old campfire sitting cold and forlorn between some rotting logs. Nearby, a few bones lay scattered, bleached and white, and a realization sunk in deep within him: he wasn't alone. He could sense eyes on him, watching, hiding just in the shadows beyond the bad light. Then there was the sound of shifting movement behind him, and he turned. Darkness flickered, writhing, a slithering thing at the edge of his vision. They were all hidden in shadow, face obscured, save for eyes, which shone like daggers in a dark, evil night that sent chills running down Edgar's back. "Get out of here," one of them whispered, a whispering sound that froze him. "The signs won't take you home." "What do you mean?" he stammered, retreating, the backs of his knees connecting with something solid. He turned, only to trip over more bones, a cruel reminder of what never was in the town. "Larkwood is a cycle," another hissed, taking a step forward, eyes alight with a passion that made Edgar feel small. "You can't escape it. You cannot leave until you understand." Before he could understand it, the earth began to tremble, cracks rending the ground. The terrible silhouettes huddled around, their whispering now more distinct. It drew its crescendo, a howling hymn of foreboding. Lost, confused. You hunted the past, and now the past hunts you. With each passing second, the sky closed itself up, blotting out normality like bloodstains on parchment, and as the signs cried with confusion, Edgar closed his eyes, and it struck him then. The truth. Larkwood was not a town, it was the monument to the law he had so very long ago roused. Fueled by sheer panic, he opened his eyes and ran. But he turned this way, and that, and always right back to that damned sign, mocking him, laughing at what it knew to be impossible. Welcome to Larkwood, 5 miles. And just like that, he knew. There he was, ensnared in the school of his fears, burdened by a place that existed nowhere else but in his head, and that it was a labyrinth from which he would never escape. And the directions of the signs would always keep changing. The car filled with faceless individuals. As Thomas Hartman drove his aging sedan along the twisting roads of Harrington Grove, the night air was crisp with the fading autumn wind. Each rotation disclosed ravaged woodlands, while twisted limbs embraced one another, like decayed digits in somber rays of moonshine. But he always had found comfort in nighttime drives, the isolation surrounding him, familiar in its sweeping embrace. But tonight, solitude was beginning to feel uneasy. He crested a rise, his headlights cutting through the dark, revealing a sight that made his stomach twist. On his right, parked on the shoulder, was a shiny black car. It was sleek and modern, a sharp departure from the surrounding decay and wilderness. Thomas slowed, curious about the vehicle. It was odd someone would be out there at this hour, but what had shocked him most was the alarming scene inside. Looking through the tinted windows, Thomas's heart stopped. There were passengers in the car at the time, but they were faceless occupants, a spine-chilling cluster of featureless faces softly gazing out over the horizon. He blinked, certain it had to be a trick of the light, but, what he honed in on, it was the same. Should he drive away? Or ask if they needed help? Overcome with an inexplicable sense of dread, he discarded the latter thought. Just as he was about to hit the gas and escape that terrifying tableau, the driver's side door of that bizarre vehicle opened and a blurred figure got out. "Hey, you!" Time was too constant a description for the sound that came then, a voice, and it called, emptying itself, filling the stillness. Thomas's breath quickened. He hit the gearshift backward, reflexive, his heart pummeling against his ribs like a hand when he caught it in his rearview mirror. It was right there, a faceless shape, precipitous and fast. Fear had turned to pure panic in him at the hollow area where they should have had a face. Tires screeching on asphalt, he wrenched the car back onto the road and slammed the pedal, racing as fast as he could away from that dreadful spectacle. Doubt and disbelief crashed against his rational thoughts as he drove away. Facelessness, was that even a thing? He could barely make sense of what he had seen. And the bumpy road stretched on and on before him, curlier and curlier, deepening him into the night. The sky wore a thin layer of clouds awash like shadows, covering the stars, bringing a mask of anonymity. Resolute to get the black car out of his mind, he switched on the radio, yearning for normalcy. Static crackled out of the speakers, more menacing than silence. The figure moved rapidly in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting outside the reach of my headlights. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel, willing himself to concentrate. When he looked in his rearview mirror, he felt the cold of terror coursing through his limbs. The black car hung behind him, floating through the dark like some ghost. It then shone with an uncanny luminosity, devouring every scrap of light around it. Foot to the floor mat, pumping his heart faster than the speedometer would read. The car grew closer, faceless passengers now visible as a small crowd staring out through impossibly dark windows, each one motionless, yet propelled by a force of unnatural menace. Adrenaline pumped, and his mind spun with theories, all of them more ludicrous than the last. Surely it is a hoax, perhaps a cruel prank by the sick-minded. But the why of it gnawed at him. Who could possibly think this was funny? Racing down the road, Thomas saw an old diner bathed in flickering neon lights. Without time to think, he turned sharply into the parking lot, tires screeching to a stop. His breath came in heaves as he leaped out of the vehicle, the world around him a cacophony of confusion. The diner, a vestige of better days, provided solace in its sameness. As he stepped inside, the warm glow of its interior engulfed him, and the air was saturated with the aroma of fried food. Behind the counter was Maggie, the silver-haired waitress with kind eyes. She glanced up from the coffee pot, eyebrows raised with concern. "Thomas, you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. The car out there. Something is wrong with it. Something wrong with the people in it." His voice was shaking, a fresh wave of panic rolling over him. Maggie's frown deepened and her intuition prickled. "What do you mean? You saw someone?" Thomas looked away toward the window. The black car had tailed him, gently parked, lifeless. Its passengers sat unmoving, like mournful statues, their faces still concealed despite the diner's lighted prominence. Just then the driver's door creaked open again, and something flickered in the deep end of the parking lot. They didn't come out until one faceless figure stepped out. Then another. They glided toward the diner, silent upon the concrete, invisible from passing eyes. Maggie looked out the window, her expression changing from concern to disbelief. Before Thomas even knew what to do next, the front door to the diner swung open with a creak and one of the shadow-cloaked, faceless phantoms stood in the entrance. The lights had dimmed ominously, and Thomas's heart had beat louder than ever, pounding in his ears like a death knell. All he could think was that the night had grown as surreal as a nightmare. He was paralyzed, tongue-tied, spineless, in an utter panic until he realized there were no communicating words, no actions, just the existential horror of being silently observed by contorted faces in a vehicle, darkened windows, approaching him in slow motion. As darkness fell, the diner grew darker and a terrible hush descended. And so it had come to this. The demarcation between one man's life and the abyss of hell had never been so blurred, and where he was now, darkness waited for him at every turn behind every corner in a place that was always intended to be punishingly just a portion of what his miserable life would ever be like. The phone call that comes from the woods. The thick forest looked ominously beyond the narrow winding road. In the evening breeze, the crimson and ochre leaves whispered faintly, blending their voice with the sounds of distant, unseen creatures. Martin had never been easily spooked, but the remoteness of the backwoods was unsettling, especially at night. Banked against the horizon, the last traces of the sun drenched into darkness, and the October air took on the chill of a problem, pouring into his car and leaving an ungainly rattle of tension in its wake. Rolling his shoulders to shake off the sense that he was being watched, he twisted the radio dial. Static hissed angrily, a memento of his remoteness from civilization. For miles, the road ahead had been blocked on either side by trees whose branches were so intertwined with one another that they reached the very edges of the road. There were campgrounds farther in, But he had deliberately avoided them. This was my escape from the city, not where to have a date with nature-loving tourists. His phone suddenly vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked down, an unknown number displaying a red alert on the screen. Martin hesitated, but his years in the high-stress corporate world had dulled his fear. He pushed the green button with a slight smirk, prepared for a furious telemarketer. "Hello." His voice mingled with the muted rustle of wind outside. The answer was barely audible, as if the caller was hiding. "Turn off your headlights. They see light." Martin was flooded with adrenaline and confusion. "Excuse me?" he asked, half laughing, anticipating a prank call from an old college buddy. But the voice was measured, almost respectful. "Turn off your headlights. They see light." There was an urgency in the voice that tugged at something deep inside him. A sudden, cold dread washed over Martin. He looked out into the dark encircling him. The trees felt alive, reaching their boughs out to him, the gnarled fingers twisting and curling like bony hands. But he dismissed it. Just nature, he reasoned. Nothing more. "Look, I don't know who you are," he started, but the call dropped. And in the silence that followed the receiver's dead air, heavy and strangling, he was tempted to brush it off as a wrong number or a deranged prankster, but something stopped him. It was then, all the way back in the way too much cold darkness of his car, he saw the headlights sending jarring pools of light out in front of him and hitting the trees, showing the thick trunks and wild underbrush. What was it about the call? It was a very lingering voice. It echoed endlessly in his head. He glanced back at the path lit in front of him. And what if there was some truth to the words? His heart beat heavily within his chest, and doubt gnawed at his logical thought. His finger hovered over the light switch for a moment, and then he turned it off. He was submerged in the rising blackness. The world beyond congealed into blurry teardrops of darkness, the edges of the woods fading to a deep, engulfing dark. He could feel his pulse racing, drumming against his ribs. The dread trickled back, but curiosity prevailed. Taking a breath that made the car's interior feel spiky and claustrophobic, Martin took a flashlight out of the glove compartment. He left the vehicle, the crunch of unseen debris crackling underfoot, and directed the beam into the gaping unknown. The flashlight's warm glow was a mere flicker in the enormity of the forest. "Hello," he called, feigning bravado. There was no reply except the chirp of crickets and the sound of leaves rustling. It seemed ridiculous to him, standing alone as he was, just a single man swimming in a sea of darkness, but he could not remove the whisper from his head. That was when, coincidentally, out of the corner of his eye he saw something moving, beyond the tree line. A glint, a shadow fading into the dark. He waved the flashlight wildly, nearly tripping over a root jutting from the ground, as he peered into the ink-black woods. Nothing. His mind raced, reliving the mystery of the call. Then came the hairs on the back of his neck. He could sense it. Something was watching, lurking just out of view. A name reverberated in the halls of his mind. "They see light." A chill crept up his spine, and a feeling of foreboding prickled at his skin. He turned back toward the car, a faint sense of panic gripping his chest. But just as he reached for the door handle, the air grew thick with an unnatural silence. All the night sounds ceased, a hush so complete it became a clatter in my ears. Then came the whispers, the soft susurrus of voices calling from deep in the woods, clustering, some baying the thick canopy of branches. They murmured incomprehensibly, brushing lightly against his ears, a spectral symphony of secrets. "Switch it on," they almost called. "Turn on the light." And then the flashlight sputtered and went out. In the darkness that fell, all safety crumbled. The shadows around him mingled, mixing the reality he understood with something more elemental and uncomfortable. Martin reached out into the unfamiliar darkness, searching for the reassurance of a familiar landscape, and all he felt was the cold of a night without stars. In a flash, a cool, unyielding thing poked into his shoulder, and the scene whipped around him, his heart pounding against his ribs. He stumbled back toward the car, panic now suffusing him, but the voice rang out again, bright and inharmonious. "Light is vulnerability. Light is death." Heaving, he jumped inside the car, battled the door and slammed it shut. His hands found the keys, fumbling as they turned in the ignition, the headlights erupting but shining only the moonlight shadow plane of darkness around them. But the whispers faded, and his phone rang again, the unfamiliar number glowing on his screen again. As he reached for it, something rustled outside, and then he froze, gazing into the stifling dark, and maybe for the first time he understood what fear really felt like. As the blood drained from him, a voice out of the woods enveloped him, reverberating, a whisper yawning in his ear, quaking the glass. "Now they see you. The thing that crawls across the road." At dusk on a late fall evening, one vehicle traversed a deserted pass in a country road. The skeletal trees, stripped of their foliage, loomed long in shadows, forming tunnels of nothingness that closed in tighter. The driver, Martin Foster, checked his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his gnarled face. Supposed to be a night out to clear his head after a long week at work, it had instead become a busy retreat where he could brandish his thoughts, and the encroaching fear that made him uneasy of late. As they sped past that narrow strip of land lined with abandoned farms, Martin's eyes glanced back to the rearview mirror. He could not shake off the sensation of being followed. He attributed it all to fatigue and shrugged off the clamminess on the back of his neck as the result of the evening air. Deep down in his gut, though, something wiggled uneasily. Minutes later, he saw it. At first, it was just a glint, a shadow moving on the road's gravelly surface, dimly lit by his headlights. No animal should be able to run that fast. He jerked to a stop, the tires screeching to a halt. Pulse quickening, he peered into the darkness. What the hell was that? He whispered to himself. Martin squeezed the steering wheel, going through excuses in his head for whoever might find him out here on his own. "A rabbit," he said, almost to himself. He bent closer to the windshield, trying to pierce through the windshield fog and dark. Then he saw it again. This time, it crept into the light, a grotesque form no bigger than a cat, but with long limbs, each joint bending at odd angles. Its body, blurred by knotted fur and filth, shone like it had emerged from a bog. The head was oddly human, albeit pulled and twisted so that the eyes were big and shiny like orbs of black glass. It didn't scuttle like an animal would. Instead, it moved with an unsettling grace that suggested an intelligence far beyond its appearance. Martin's throat went dry. The thing froze for a beat, its unholy eyes coming to rest on his. Something in its appearance posed an ancient challenge, a primal threat that tapped into something primal deep within. He told himself he was going crazy. Nightmarish creatures weren't real, though, right? Certainly, this was an example of his overstimulated, fatigued mind. But it kept coming. Each step was purposeful and smooth as the being started walking towards the car. Martin's reflexes took over, and in a split second, he stomped on the gas pedal, sending the car flying down the road, away from whatever had encroached on his way. Trees shot by and their silhouettes blurred into an unyielding dark, and the logic of escape fled the senses. But his thoughts churned and a sound started to infiltrate the cabin, a soft, regular drumming that reverberated with every heartbeat. The sound reverberated around his mind and his head, louder and louder. He took a risk and looked in the passenger side mirror. The creature was following. What should have been impossible took shape with terrible clarity. The thing moved faster than his car. It zipped from the shadows, a whirlwind of motion and malice. It crossed grass, jumped old branches, weaved about trees like it had cat speed, never really getting ahead of him but never falling behind either. Panic became desperation as Martin tire squealed off the road and raced down a dirt path he just knew must lead somewhere, the colors of his surroundings fading into chaos. His heart was racing beyond that wild beat inside his ears. He could sense it, imminent. Flankers of trees met either side, briefly if imperviously trapping him in a choking boat of black. Then came a booming thud that rattled the vehicle, and the car lurched violently. Martin heard the back tire explode, and he lost control, tumbling in the air and crashing into a jutting tree trunk. The world spun around him, and then ground to a punishing halt. There was silence for a beat, and then he sensed it, the weight at the end of the shattered glass moving closer. He looked through the broken window with a sense of thrumming horror. The creature hung there, advancing, eyes aflame with unholy ravenousness. The motives of the miasma, as twisted as its form, made Martin's heart fall into an abyss. In that horrible moment of quiet, he understood the truth. This was no ordinary creature of the night. it wasn't merely stalking and hunting. It was branding him, an ingrained scar burned into the core of what he was. With nowhere to go, nowhere to escape, the air was thick with inevitability, and any meager strength he had was sapped, leaving behind a mere husk. As the night closed in, he realized, it's not always the monsters haunting you that you're most afraid of. It's the other one, the ghost of the knowledge that what scutters worst along the highway isn't just hunting you, it's haunting your own worst fears, biding its time for the moment you feel yourself utterly and irreversibly alone. The last meal at Rita's diner. The sound of rubber rolling on asphalt was soothing, a lullaby that had kept James alert for miles. His old sedan had taken him for hours on end the last couple of days along stretches of blank highway far in the middle of the body. It was at dusk when he saw the flickering neon sign offering Rita's Diner, home of the best comfort food. A tempting refuge at the end of the day, he thought. Anyway, he might as well have something to eat before the night set in fully. James parked and stepped into the cool evening air, a gentle breeze wafting the reassuring aroma of fried things and coffee. It was a lonely diner sitting by the roadside, its windows alight as if to beckon weary travelers within. As he passed through the door, a small bell chimed above him. The decor was a nostalgic tableau of checkerboard tiles, Formica countertops, and faded diner chairs. It was as if stepping into an epoch where time and care exhaled itself in every corner. James saw only a smattering of patrons throughout the diner, mostly aged, their faces lined and pale against the colors of the decor. They looked up at him, but quickly got back to their meals, silence eating up the air. "Welcome," a cheery voice shouted from behind the counter. His first encounter was with a stout woman who greeted him with a welcoming smile and a mane of flame-red hair bouncing in the dimming light. "What can I get you?" James slid into one of the vinyl booths, its cracks nipped by years of sitting. He ordered a hamburger and French fries, and while waiting he watched the other patrons absently. One couple sat hunched over their plates, whispering, their eyes shifting to him and back. In the far corner, an old man with sunken cheeks looked right at him, simultaneously curious and hostile. Habib's meal arrived, the plate steaming with the smell of grilled beef and fresh-cut potatoes. The first mouthful was bliss, an unexpected voyage to flavors that tickled long-buried memories. But as he chomped away, an unsettling feeling stirred in his gut. The din in the diner grew thick, every fork scraping on plates a tug at a choker, the other patrons' conversations muted and vague as if caught in some radio trap between stations. James had finished the last of his meal and shoved his plate away. "Can I get the check?" he called to Rita, who was absorbed in conversation with another customer. The woman turned to look at him, her smile strained, then went back to them. Minutes dragged by. Maybe they were busy, he thought, and looked back at the door, which he expected was wide open. But somehow it lessened, the darkness outside deepened, and the diner's light wiped at the edges of the outside world. James stood and walked toward the door. But when he grabbed the handle, it wouldn't move. Fear punched the air from his lungs as he rattled the door. "Hey," he shouted, looking back over his shoulder. "Is this a joke?" The diners all turned in unison, their eyes locking on him in an uncanny synchrony that sent a shudder creeping down his spine. The old man who had been looking at him was standing up, his gaunt body throwing a long shadow on the tile. "What are you doing here?" he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "What do you mean?" Pressing up against the door again, James could feel his heart racing and anxiety surging through his veins. "Rita's doesn't let people go," the man said, as he waved one bony finger, quavering. "Once you're inside, you stay, until you're ready." "Ready for what?" James asked, his voice getting louder. He noticed the smiles on the faces of the customers were grimacing, and their eyes were glinting with some sort of hunger. They were watching, waiting, and he was the prey. All of a sudden, one of the men at the counter let out a guttural laugh. "You'll find out soon enough. Don't fight it." A chorus of nods and murmurs immediately followed, and his stomach turned in dread. At that point, Rita came over, her eyes gone cloudy, a calm smile frozen on her face. "You've had your meal, dear. Now, it's time for dessert." She pointed to a door at the back of the diner labeled staff only. "No. Let me out," he yelled, trying the door again to no avail. Rita just shook her head, a knowing light flickering in her eyes. It was at that point that James understood, with brutal clarity. The other diners wore empty expressions as well, as if they'd arrived before he had, and were trapped in just as he was. Whatever ritual this little diner excelled in, he didn't want to be part of it. Now, a desperation pooling in him, he spun and ran into the back, and through the kitchen, where the odor of grease was intermingling with something much more evil. And fear led on, and he scratched at the door, wanting out. But at the door, the world outside disappeared, the diner folding in on itself, suspended in a purgatory of hospitality. He turned around and saw Rita and her patrons looking once again, patient light in their eyes. They were hungry, but not for food, something different, his soul maybe, or his will. All James heard was the jackal laugh of the wee doorbell as it opened for him and shut behind him, and laughed at him as his madness split second and echoed his silence and the gathering shadows of the hungry that had arrived at this diner before him, all those fucked before him, all waiting ever so patiently for another meal to be served. The truck that wants to run you off the road. Blinding white swam in the rearview mirror. John, who was already jumpy from the late hour and the drone of the boring highway, squinted. A behemoth of a semi-truck was glued to his bumper, its high beams stabbing straight through his tiny sedan. He eased down on the brakes, trying to get the trucker to fall back. The reaction was quick and brutal. A thunderous blast of the air horn pierced the night, and an even closer chase ensued. The truck's chrome-heavy grille glared back at him in the mirror, a predatory glint reflected off its polished surface. "Jesus Christ," John mumbled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He looked at the speedometer. He was already going 75. What did this guy want? He forced his eyes away from the mess, instead counting the illuminated dashes of the highway. But the truck was relentless. With each blare of the horn, shivers crawled down his spine. The beams punched straight through him like sledgehammers to the gut. It was obvious that this wasn't simply impatience. This was deliberate. It was terrifying how big the truck was. It towered behind him, a metal beast intent on devouring him whole. He had a brief, deranged thought that the truck wasn't being driven, but was instead hunting. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the driver was drunk. Perhaps he was experiencing some sort of psychotic break. But there was something about the relentless intensity, the almost pure malice echoing from the ceaseless machine, that felt different, felt wrong. The truck started swaying, its giant tires edging toward the dividing line. John jerked the steering wheel reflexively, holding his car tightly in its lane. His heart now synced to the rhythm of the truck now matched him inch by inch, a wordless deal made in the ether. Okay, this was enough. He couldn't outrun it. He had to let it pass. He flicked on his right turn signal and began pulling over onto the shoulder, his heart racing against his ribs. Dust billowed up around his car as he slowed, the truck roaring ever more loudly now like a caged beast smelling blood. He prepared for the deafening rush of air as it swooshed past, anticipating one last, victorious blare of the horn. He clenched the steering wheel, his eyes tightly shut. But the roar didn't pass. It just stopped. He opened his eyes, bracing for the sight of the pickup's grille pushing against his rear window. But nothing was visible in the rearview mirror. Just the stretch of black ribbon of the highway behind him lit only the path of his taillights. He looked to his left. Nothing. To the right of him, across the median. Still nothing. The truck was gone. Vanished. He swallowed, his throat feeling suddenly dry. Had he imagined it? Fatigue playing tricks on his mind? But the smell of diesel and the adrenaline still pumping through his veins said otherwise. Pausing to breathe, he put the car back in drive and slowly propelled it back onto the highway, watching his mirrors obsessively. Every new set of headlights sent a saddle of panic through him. The next several miles were more or less uneventful. He began to talk himself into thinking that he had overreacted. Maybe the driver had been an aggressive jerk who finally had gotten tired of it. As he came around a long, sweeping curve, he spotted it. A rest stop, illuminated by the harsh glow of security lights. A welcome sight. He needed to stop, desperately, to gather himself, to try to figure out what had just happened. His hands still shaky, he eased into a parking spot. The lot was relatively empty, except for a few other cars and a semi-truck. A huge one. Time froze, and blood in his veins went to ice. It was the same truck. He knew it instinctively. The chrome grille was still there, as was the same menacing presence, despite it being parked and silent. It sat in the dimmest corner of the lot, its cab turned away from the rest stop as if attempting concealment. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't a coincidence. He was being followed. But who, or what was in control of this thing? As his fingers hovered over the buttons, they felt clumsy, inept. He needed to call the police. He needed to get out of here. Before he could dial, somebody stepped out from behind the truck's cab and the trailer. Tall and thin, with eyes that appeared to absorb the light around them. He could not see detail, but the figure was watching him. John threw the car into reverse and squealed the tires as he backed out of the parking space. He did not hesitate to turn back. He spun the car around and floored the gas, backtracking the way he came, leaving the rest stop and the oncoming truck behind. He didn't look back. He drove for hours, barely stopping for gas, until the sun started to rise, streaking the eastern sky with a cascade of orange and pink. Not until he was miles down the road from the rest stop, and the dark presence that haunted him there, did he pull over to the side of the road, battered and terrified. He never saw the truck again. But each time he drives late at night, each time he sees a pair of headlights approaching too quickly in his rearview mirror, a cold knot of fear tightens in his stomach. He knows, down deep, that it exists, out there, somewhere, lurking in the dark, waiting for the right opportunity to push him off the road. And he realizes that it's more than a truck. It's something far, far worse. The impromptu running automobiles. Fallen leaves braided across the highway, the waning afternoon colors mingling with shadows and dust when Nathan Mercer found himself washed up on a winding country road. A drive had turned into a nightmare late morning. His vintage Chevrolet, a beast of beauty and nostalgia, choked one last time and was spent, leaving him with nothing but chirping crickets and rustling dry leaves as they danced gustily around the roadside gravel. Nathan got out of the car and swore gently as he kicked a sprinkling of dirt out from behind the tires. His signal was non-existent, a cruel stroke of fate, leaving him stranded with only the option of walking to the nearest town. The air was heavy with an otherworldly silence. Nothing in it, out here, in the fringes of humanity's touch, gave away that other sounds of nature were hiding from him. As he pulled open the passenger's side door to collect his jacket, the Chevrolet thundered back to life. He whirled, eyes widening as the engine throbbed with a power he hadn't felt in months. The headlights twitched, throwing ghostly flashes on the fading light. Nathan rubbed at his eyes, trying to clear away whatever trickery his mind played on him. "Hello," he called out uncertainly, half waiting for a practical joke or maybe a childhood buddy trying to come over and scare him silly. But silence came back, a suffocating blanket on the land around him. The red US car glistened, under the dying light of the sun, orange and crimson sparkled off the metallic surface. But then he thought maybe it was a straightforward electrical problem. It had happened before. But a nagging sense that something more was afoot gnawed at him. Drawn by equal parts curiosity and instinctual apprehension, Nathan crept back up to the car, carefully, like it was a wounded wild animal. It seemed impossible. How could the engine have started running without him? Is the battery coming back to life, perhaps? Right, let me see, Nathan bumbled, insinuating himself back into the driver's seat, his fingers skimming the steering wheel. There was about the interior something odd, as if it was alive with invisible energy. The car erupted into flame as though it was a dying star in the void. The lights on the dash flicked on and off like a Halloween decoration. The radio burst into gnarled life, static grazed the ethers of his senses, and the liquid audio of antiquity whispered in the wind. Forgetting the chills running up his spine, Nathan grabbed the gear stick the moment the radio started, and a whisper left it, almost inaudible but human. "Turn back." Nathan's heart dropped like a rock. Stunned, he yanked the key from the ignition. Silence settled once more, thick and heavy. It was just him, the road, the car, and the woodland darkness encroaching at the edges. "Okay, this is just too weird," he breathed, gnawing at his cheek on the inside, half thinking he ought to walk again. But it was too tempting. Curiosity was gnawing at him. He slid the key into the slot and adrenaline kicked in, drowning out the throb of the engine, which tore through the air like thunder. He turned the key. The whisper rose to a howl, louder now. "Stop driving." A chill shot across the hairs at the back of Nathan's neck, and he slammed his foot onto the brake. The lamps outside pulsed like some world-breathing thing. An instinct, primal and unrefined, beckoned him to put the car in reverse, to escape the growing panic. "Leave this place," it insisted, but Nathan, overwhelmed with fright and fascination, shifted into drive and left the shoulder, tires spitting gravel like something frightened. There was an unseen hand tugging on the wheel, guiding him, whispering directions that wove back and forth through the gathering darkness. The road ahead snaked like the branches of the gnarled trees that stretched over him, dark fingers extending for his freedom. Nathan was dazed, as if the car had a mind of its own. Trembling flashes burst in and out of his field of vision. Blurred bodies leapt to the edge of his periphery, their eyes and mouths shrinking and bowing into shadow. He could feel the whispering press upon him. Every mile was a deeper slide into panic, the whispers rising to urgent cries. "Stop the car," they urged. "Turn back while you can." The darkness enveloped him. The anomaly of this reality devoured his sanity. Nathan pushed so hard on the brake that the tires squealed in protest before the car surrendered to inertia with a screeching halt. Breathless, he withdrew his shaking hands from the steering wheel, his vision blitting between the mundane and the nightmarish. From inside he heard it again. This time the voice was firm, angry even. "Get out." Nathan opened the door with a shudder, his mind a tempest of dread and determination. When he got out, the air felt different, gel-like, and it latched onto him with boneless determination. As he stepped out, the engine thundered back to life for one last time. A howl bellowed up the trees, shredding through the darkening weight of oncoming night. The tires growled menacing in the gravel. The car leapt away through the shaded figure of trees bracing themselves in the darkness, and left Nathan back against the slowly stilling night, to the coldest chill of aloofness, and he can hardly tell whether he was in fact alone. "Don't follow." He stopped, horror-struck and transfixed, watching the taillights of the Chevrolet dissolve into the void, the car that had brought him to the abyss and walked him to its precipice and then beyond.